session so that we get an accurate count of how many people are here. And that's important because it means next time we meet, it means we're not in one of the little tiny rooms all packed together like sardines.
All right, welcome to DIEM, everyone. If you were expecting something other than digital emblems, you are in the wrong room. The agenda for today starts with brave souls volunteering to take notes. It's a fantastic way to get familiar with working group material. I've put a link in the chat for those of you who are unfamiliar with how the note-taking tools work here. Just click there and you'll get an interactive session. We can have multiple people taking notes to catch things, no problem. We're gonna start with the note well and general IETF info, and then go through as a new working group how the deliverables, the agreed upon charter are going to work. After that, we have Rahel and Felix here to present on the progress for a document for the first deliverable. After that, we'll go open discussion. And at the end, we'll see what we have agreed on thus far. Any agenda bashing before we proceed? All right. So this is the note well. Some of you have seen this before. That's nice. We're going to talk about it anyway. For those of you who are new to the IETF also, what's discussed here, it has specific legal guidance regarding patents. If you know that there's something being discussed here for which there's a patent pending, or that you have a patent, you need to say so, or you need to not participate. None of this is legal guidance. You should seek your own sponsors or your own counsel if you find yourself in that situation. By being here, you are agreeing to abide by the rules and principles of the IETF. There are plenty of excellent links on this slide. Please check them out if you are unfamiliar. By being here also and coming to the mic line, you're going to find yourself on a YouTube recording of this meeting. So if you're not okay with that, don't do that. And of course, we have information handling under the privacy policy. We'll talk about the Ombuds team here on the next slide. This is intended to be a professional, collaborative, friendly environment. We can disagree on things, but we do not tolerate harassment. So if you feel like anyone is mistreating you or there's threatening going on, please say something. The Ombuds team, the Ombuds persons are fantastic people, and you should feel safe going to them with any issues you may run into. Does anyone have any questions about the note well? All right. So for those of you who are less familiar with how the IETF works, on the way in, you scanned a QR code or joined the MeetEcho tool, and if you didn't, you should go back up and scan that QR code up on the upper platform. No one will judge you. That tool will have a raise of hands control, and that is how you join the mic line. And that's how we're going to keep everyone in order and give an opportunity both to those on site and those remote. So please use that if you want to queue up. And then if you happen to be joined remotely, please keep yourself muted and off video until you are speaking. Links for follow-up, the DIEM working group page will link to these things as well as the slides that you're seeing today. And a note on the technical assistance, the technical crew here at the IETF is phenomenal and they respond very quickly to things, so don't take that as a side reference. They solve a lot of problems.
So before we get started, we really need to identify a note taker. So do we have a volunteer? It would be even better if we have 2. Please, this is your community. You are providing service to your community by taking notes. You don't need to give a blow-by-blow, but you do need to capture the essence of what was discussed, particularly if there's any consensus or any conclusion from some discussion. Come on, folks, we can do this. All right, for the record, could you please state your name?
Sarah Jennings.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Very good. So, quick recap. This time last year, we kicked off with a dream, and today that dream is real. We're a real working group, and this is our first meeting. Congratulations to everyone. We know it was a lot of hard work to get here. Up front, you have Rohan and I as your chairs, and right here in the second row is our very responsible area director, Ori. If you have any complaints about anything, you should go to him before you go to us, I think is how the rules work. He's shaking his head. So now that we are a working group, the real work can begin. This is a link to the charter, which is now going to be our guiding text to determine what is and is not in scope and what order we do things. And these are the 3 deliverables that are defined. The first is a use cases and requirements document. The goal for this document is not necessarily to be published as an RFC, but it should be publication ready, meaning that we have consensus in this room, as well as consensus from external review, from the IESG, for example, which for those of you new to the IETF, the IESG is a collection of leadership like area directors that are above working groups whose review is intended to see that this is consistent with the work from other working groups, or the DNS directorate. With this in place, the idea is that there will be a taxonomy of requirements that the future documents can refer to by specific requirement name number, which brings us to step 2. After we have that document, we want to see an extensible architecture. This is another singular document and is intended to show the plan for, in order to meet the requirements from step 1, we need to have this kind of functionality, not intended to define technical mechanisms, but to define what mechanisms are needed. That document, we do expect to be published as an RFC, as technical mechanism RFCs will need to take a dependency on it. With both of those documents in consensus and or published, then we build the actual technical solutions. This is the stage at which the working group can then take its take opinion on which of the requirements they want to work on first, whereas these 2 steps need to be overly inclusive of what we expect the working group to work on going forward. So step 3 is where we can do ordering of work. The first 2, we're going to talk about everything that we think is reasonably within scope for this working group now and onward, so that we don't have to revisit step 1 especially, for hopefully the majority of the lifetime of this working group. So does anyone, I believe that's my last slide. So does anyone have any questions about these 3 deliverables or how the work is planned? All right. Use the tool.
Yep, and I'm just going to underline something that Tommy already said. So the requirements, we don't want to have to come back to the requirements as we add more functionality in the future, as we add new emblems or new requirements. So we're not restricted, nor do we want to be restricted to the initial charter for the first or the second milestones. We need to be clear on identifying which use cases and which requirements will be covered by the initial scope, but we don't want to restrict the documenting of the requirements to be things that are only possible in the initial scope.
All right, Samit?
Thanks, Tommy. So if I understand correctly, today, really, like from your agenda, we would be looking at 1 and 2, but the discussion on protocol specifications would it be in today's meeting?
Even narrower, today we'll be talking about 1 specifically.
1, okay, all right, thanks.
So I'm seeing some commentary in the chat questioning the charter limitations. So let me clarify. Step 3 is where we're doing technical mechanisms, and that work is restricted to what's in the charter. To do anything for a technical mechanism that doesn't meet the initial charter will require a rechartering. Steps 1 and 2 are describing the scope of what this working group, whose domain is started off very controversial, what would go to the Emblem working group? Meaning if something came to a dispatch meeting, would they be told you need to come to DIEM and possibly seek a recharter, or would they be told you need to do your own working group? So hopefully that clarifies things. The use cases and requirements document we'll be talking about today does need to be clear about which requirements actually fall into the initial scope. But that doesn't mean that we can't continue listing out the examples so that future versions of the working group, which may contain people that aren't in this room today, understand where this working group will really be allowed to go. Because at some point we don't recharter for everything, and this document is helpful in determining where that can be and informing what kind of technical requirements may hit us in the future. All right. With that, we will turn to our, did you have some? With that, we'll turn to our presenters. So come on up and we'll switch the slides. It'll start working in 1 second.
Just why don't you guys both introduce each other at the very beginning as well?
Oh, yeah. We're going to talk to you about the use cases and requirements. My name is Rahel Feinstein, and this is Felix.
Hi, I am Felix Linker, as said on the slides. Amongst other things, I'm a researcher at ETH Zurich.
Okay. So in general, the goals are to illustrate a representative subset of the requirements for digital emblem. So what we mean by representative is generally encompassing a pretty illustrative set of use cases that would, and also requirements in themselves to give a general taste of where this document would be going. So as I said, requirements, we want to arrive at a set of requirements that we identify from these use cases. And then we'll include cases beyond the initial charter of the scope. So like was mentioned before, we will do our best to identify when something is outside of the initial charter scope, but we're still not going to restrict ourselves in mentioning that use case because it might be something in what we think is the likely event of a future recharter that the group would be working on. So again, we're aiming for completeness and for consensus on these use cases and structure for that document. So kind of to hit the horse on the head here, we have the set of representative use cases. We'll give an overview of some of the requirements we identified across all of the use cases, and then we'll kind of give a rough outline of that future draft that we're working on. So again, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here. So the working group is, this is quoted from the charter. So we're not actually seeking to change anything in the charter. So with that, moving forward, here are some use cases.
Yeah, I'll start with 2 use cases and illustrate them. They have been illustrated numerous times before, but to get everyone on the same page. These are all motivated by international humanitarian law, IHL. So you may know the emblems of the Red Crescent, Red Cross, and Red Crystal. These can be worn, for example, by medical personnel in the field to signal that these people undertake some medical function and that they should be respected and protected. We've been for a number of years now working on digitizing that version to also apply to digital assets. And here again, the semantics of this emblem is that an asset serves a medical function and should be respected and protected. In particular, it should not be disrupted or attacked. And this stems from the legal protection under IHL. A rough summary of the requirements that we have identified for this use case is that we would like to label network connected devices, which is currently not possible with a physical Red Cross. The emblem should be removable because sometimes it could happen that a Red Cross is more a target sign than a sign of protection. We would like these emblems to be verifiably authentic. They must follow a decentralized authorization mechanism because states prior to using these emblems must authorize the bearers to do so. We would like to have a functionality of accountability of illicit display. So if I, for example, put a digital emblem on my personal web server, that should be a digital Red Cross, Red Crescent, and Red Crystal, that should be prosecuted, or it should be able to prosecute that. And a requirement that has had many names. Right now it's being called undetectable validation. So a validator that is checking if an asset has a digital emblem should not identify the bearer about the emblem being checked, because that might warn the target of an imminent cyber attack, because that's exactly why you would want to check the emblem. There's a second emblem quite similar to this. So I highlighted the difference with a little underline here. There's also the blue shield emblem, which can be used in a very similar way when it comes to the to the requirements as the Red Cross. The blue shield signals that some asset has cultural significance and thus should be respected and protected and not be disrupted or attacked. But the requirements for this use case are the same. Now, Rahel, you want to go over to present some more?
Okay, so a third use case that we identified was protections for the press, particularly for their equipment, their digital infrastructure, and for actual members of the press. This is a similar humanitarian law type protection. They're protected as non-combatants. So from that, we identified a few requirements there. So we needed these to identify characteristics of the entity being protected. So when it comes to the type, is it a person? Is it equipment? Is it a piece of network infrastructure? Then on top of that, with whom is it affiliated, or by whom is it authorized? And then finally, we need the bearer's ability to kind of be able to effectively turn on and turn off the display of the emblem as well, because members of the press, similar to humanitarian organizations and actors, can be viewed as targets as well. Beyond that, we also have a use case for the for the prohibition of chemical weapons, or OPCW, and they protect highly sensitive chemicals in transit. These can be used for research, be it medical uses or pharmaceutical ones. And finally, they might be for protective ones as well. In that case, we identified that we needed, again, a description of the characteristics of the bearer. So that would be their location, because a lot of times this is tracking something that's in transit, so it would need to be a dynamic location. A textual description of what the actual contents are and the quantity of the contents that are in transit. Unlike previous examples, this one would have to have what we're terming selective disclosure, meaning that they'd need to be able to encrypt the description of the contents being sent over, so that only people who are tracking or authorized to do so or involved in the transfer can actually access those. And then finally, they need to support traffic and verification of a chain of custody. And that will be not only for issuance of the emblem, but issuance of authorization that it made it to a certain spot along its line of transit. Another use case that we looked at was the Ramsar wetlands. From their website, they describe this is an international agreement that provides the framework for cooperation on wetland issues. So on this slide, there are a few screenshots from the website's entry on the Via Lake in Bulgaria, just to illustrate some of the features that would be shown. And the main idea is that designating a protected status to these locations, they're doing it for largely for ecological reasons, to protect species that live there, etc. So in that vein, some of the requirements that we identified there were support for querying by location. So if someone were to give a shape denoting a geographic range where they would want to search, this would give them back a set of all of the digital emblems for, in this case, Ramsar wetlands that were in that area. And then additionally, there would be the ability to search by the actual identifier of a protected wetland, which would mean that someone would be able to do that and get information about the wetland. And so some of that information in itself would again be a textual description, as well as habitat information. So what kind of species are protected in that location? How large is it? And so beyond that, there would also be fields like how it's designated or treated globally, what protections it might have within the national boundaries where it's located, and also finally, its geographic location. So the coordinates of the location and, like I mentioned before, the area boundaries. So kind of summing all of that up, here are some pieces that we kind of pieced together of requirements that and how they corresponded to different use cases. So for authenticity, we found that that was a requirement across the board for the 5 use cases that we presented. Same thing for authorization. The restriction on validation was limited to cases where someone who was querying would potentially have repercussions for doing that, but was required to do so. And in a similar vein, it being removable was because of the dangers that someone displaying it might encounter. Selective disclosure was only something that OPCW mentioned, and then marking that an asset that is only digital was, again, only in a much more limited subset. So when it comes to scope, this is kind of roughly where we believe the scope lies, meaning we think that whether a physical place is included in the initial scope seems kind of murky, but things that are a bit more that are not quite as well depicted in DNS, at least, for lack of better thoughts, may be for beyond the scope. But again, this is kind of our initial rough assessment based on what the working group decides. We can move the lines up or down. So that would be something to think about.
Yeah, also as a highlight, I'm not sure whether Rahel has said it, apologies if I repeat her. It's important to note that in this presentation, we neither intended to present a complete set of use cases nor a complete set of requirements. I'll now go over to the structure of the use cases and requirement document and the goals that we propose to you. And we think that what you saw on the previous slides will make it in one way or the other into this use cases and requirements document, but many details have to be discussed yet. So if you think we grossly misrepresented a use case, that is important, but if you think like, oh, but I would like to set a footnote on requirement X on slide 10, maybe that, yeah, we can discuss it, but maybe today is not the day. So the goals of the use cases and requirement that we identified, that it should, as Tommy had and Rohan had said earlier, it should be usable for the future work of the working group, but still we believe it's important to clearly highlight which requirements we believe are addressable within the initial scope of the charter. We want to highlight which use cases have which requirements, because we think it's important to distinguish between the different use cases and requirements. It's not a one-size-fits-all problem space that we have here. And clearly, we want to also clearly label requirements so that future technical work can reference individual requirements and say, for example, a draft focuses on the discovery of digital emblems in the DNS in a way that implements the undetectable validation requirement. For example, that could be one way forward. The structure is fairly simple, and it will roughly follow the bullet points here. We'll have, as always, the terminology section. Terminology is important and will need to be refined drastically. We will have an extensive description of use cases following the sketches that you saw earlier, clearly labeled requirements, and a table following the rough sketch that you also saw earlier, showing which use case has which requirements, and then also say there which requirements are maybe shoulds or musts. Then, as usual, you have other sections following, such as security and privacy considerations, and there may be some use cases that have been mentioned in the past, and for completeness, we intend to reference them all in the appendix for those where we didn't have time or sufficient input to engineer all the requirements in detail. That brings me to our summary. So today you saw some a representative set of use cases and requirements that we think cover many of the requirements that have been mentioned in the past. You just saw the structure of the use cases and requirements document, and again, the idea is that individual technical standards can choose the problems they will solve within this big problem space. Now for the discussion, but maybe Rohan and Tommy, you have input, feel free to jump in on that. It would be good to know if any use cases were grossly misrepresented, whether you think that the structure of the use case and requirements and its goal makes sense, and whether there's anything else. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so we're going to open the mic line to ask questions about the presentation and requirements only. So please focus in the first round of questions on questions which are clarifying questions or trying to understand what was presented, and not necessarily to give your opinion about what should or should not be there. And then we're going to have lots of time. We have lots of, we have another hour and a half left in the session. So we're going to have plenty of time for people to give their opinions about what should or shouldn't be. Who's in the queue?
Chantal, go ahead.
Then lower your hand.
So Chantal clarifies that her question is more appropriate for later. Jim, go ahead.
Jim Reed. I think that Rachel and Felix have done a wonderful job here. I think it's a very good starting point, and this will help us crystallize what we're going to try to achieve over the coming months. So kudos to you for that. I have a couple of concerns though. On your initial slide, Rachel, you mentioned about trying to enumerate all the potential use cases or a substantial number of them. That kind of concerns me a lot because we could eventually end up trying to boil the ocean here. So I think we have to be careful that we don't try to overextend ourselves or overreach ourselves. And we may come to the point we have to take ourselves to a triage type approach. This stuff is interesting, but it's kind of out of scope. We can capture it as a potential use case or requirement, but we're not going to do anything more than to just simply document the fact that this is a potential use case. I think that might be a reasonable compromise position there. But if you try to enumerate everything, we'll never ever be able to get out of the weeds because the IETF has a long noble tradition of rat holing and everything. And we want to try and avoid that if we possibly can. In terms of the requirements that you suggested for the document itself, I think these are good. But it might be better, I feel, perhaps to split these into separate requirement documents for each of the individual use cases. This is my personal preference here. And then we can maybe prioritize these ones. And let's see if we can get the stuff done for the humanitarian use case first, then look at something for the Blue Shield emblems, and then for the press or whatever. I don't have a really strong opinion about that. But again, I think if we can somehow compartmentalize the work, it might be easier and quicker to try and push things forwards. And maybe we can say later on, if we've got a discrete set of documents, can they be merged or should they be merged? But that might be better than trying to come with a single overarching document that looks all about the use cases and requirements for all potential scenarios you've got here. It could be done, but who knows what's happening? But I think it may be better to break it into smaller, discrete chunks. Thanks.
Hi, Andrew Campling. I agree broadly with what Jim just said, but I note that the charter at the moment requires us to adopt a draft on sort of use case requirements by the end of July 2025. So that's quite soon.
Yeah. Yes. So quick word from the chairs on that. Milestones are aspirations. Let's take the time needed to do the job right. Okay. So don't over-index on those. We can update those as needed.
Okay, great. But as I say, nevertheless, Jim's suggestion, I think, is probably better. Slide 14, if we may. Where you drew that line, without getting into specifically where the line should be drawn, don't care. The implication, I presume, is that any of those use cases with requirements below that line is sort of implicit, therefore, that those wouldn't be progressed in the short term. Is that correct, or have I misunderstood?
That is an accurate understanding.
Great, thank you.
Eric Vac, and thank you so much for making this group alive and seeing some progress. More seriously now, I mean, my previous one was serious anyway. Currently, there are two drafts. Are they being merged together? Because Sheila is mainly about use case and Felix more about requirements. Will they be merged, or will be a third draft and then those two will be abandoned somehow?
There would most likely be a third draft that we ended up going with.
All right, that sounds sensible. Related to Andrew's questions, are there requirements that are conflictual? Then you can get requirement 1 or 2, but not both together. Should this be identified? Maybe that's possible, right? I don't know.
I mean, it's hard for me to definitely say, but I think there's at least a tension between selective disclosure and undetectable validation. Yeah, so.
Yeah, that's the one I got in mind, right? Yes. And the last questions about the Rochelle part, the use case one. How do we intend as a working group, or you as the author, to validate the requirement for some use case? I mean, I guess for you, Red Cross and UNESCO and so on, they are low, so that's okay. But what about press, for instance? Ron, you have maybe an answer.
Okay, so there are specific laws. They're not international laws, but there are specific laws that provide that provide for special treatment of people in the press, and there are additionally a number of I don't want to say convention because that has a specific meaning in international law, but there's sort of traditional treatment even in countries that do not have very strong protection laws for the press. I'm not sure, I think it matters in that personally I've been using a definition of an emblem is something that usually is related to something which has special treatment in law. The press use case definitely qualifies under that specific definition. I wanted to bring up one other thing, however, which is about selective disclosure. So selective disclosure is like, this is perhaps was unwise to use this terminology here because it is a specific technology. It is not the actual requirement. So if the actual requirement is that I need to be able to say one thing to one person and one thing to another person, then that's going to be scoped based on whether that's in the same country or that's for the same target or the same category of targets. So we want to be very crisp about what the requirement is and not predispose a specific technological solution for any given requirement.
Okay, and I guess the mapping between a law and technical requirements are obvious or not?
If I could first answer your first question, I think we need stakeholder input.
Yeah. What?
We need stakeholder input.
Okay.
Yeah.
To
evaluate the requirements.
Yeah. And we got the Red Cross here. I mean, Red Cross and the others, but the others is maybe more. Okay. Anyway, continue the good job.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Actually, it just ties into what you just said, Felix. I'm wondering if both of you can go through the different sort of different potential digital emblems that you presented and talk about which stakeholders you've spoken to that have actually presented these, like where do these requirements come from? And maybe a bit more than that, are those stakeholders like in the room? Can they also sort of present their opinion? Maybe not now, but later. Because I think it would be important to then see sort of that relationship between, okay, these are the requirements that have been identified, and here are the stakeholders that have identified them or that are involved in the conversation.
Yeah, I can speak on the first two. So, Samit, I have collaborated with you on the red cross use case. But beyond that, the ICRC has engaged a number of stakeholders over the last years. There's a report on it, invited people to meetings. The findings have been published. I guess the report on the digital emblem from the ICRC can be found online. Then for the Blue Shield, this got later added into the pipeline, and we have spoken to UNESCO. But I would say that I would like more input from UNESCO here, but that would be one of the stakeholders that should be engaged. Yeah.
So just to quickly, go ahead and I'll add at the end.
Okay, I can speak to Ramsar, which we've reached out to them and have seen some interest in the implementation. We're still hoping to get some more input from them, though.
So just to add to that, as the chairs, we encourage the authors to be brave with the information they had available, in the spirit of there's no better way of getting a right answer than posting a wrong one. We're not here to try and dictate to other people their requirements are, but we have to act on whatever information we have. And the idea is we want to solicit more input from every stakeholder. And if that does mean if we can't, that we need to back off, put less detail, that's fine. But the goal is to bring more people here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Chantal. I'm with Article 19, Freedom of Expression Organization. I want to raise some concerns that we've discussed this internally about including the press emblem as a potential use case. Of course, it's mentioned that humanitarian law protects journalists, civilians. I'm simplifying. The reality is, though, that they are not similar to, say, humanitarian organizations. They report on the conduct of the hostilities. They're very often targeted specifically, both physically and digitally. And we are very concerned that sort of including the press as a use case and potentially press using those emblems, that will put a target on their back more than anything. I would also say that there is no conflict party or country that we've seen that is law-abiding in the sense that they haven't taken steps that are detrimental to media freedom or even target the press directly. So we will be extremely cautious there, and also following up on this fact of stakeholder engagement. The reality of the press is very different in different contexts, so I think it's extremely important to do a detailed risk assessment overall of the inclusion of this use case, and that needs to be based on extensive stakeholder consultation across the different regions. Thank you.
Could you please stay at the microphone? So we have could you please stay near the microphone? I have a clarifying question for you. So we had a presentation from someone who was a former Reuters. He was formerly at Reuters in charge of their protection unit, and has worked extensively in this field. He advocated for digital emblems for that particular purpose. Certainly, if we get an emblem for press and people in the press don't want to use them, then they're certainly under no obligation to use them. But if we have people from the press who do want these emblems, I'm not sure what your concern is. I mean, we can equally well say this for, as a former humanitarian myself, I can say that I have witnessed colleagues being mistreated, being killed, being kidnapped in contravention of international humanitarian law. That doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. So that's not the purpose of emblems, is not to protect people from violating the emblem. It's for making sure that they know that the information in the emblem is there.
Can I follow up on that? Or?
That's why I asked you to stay.
Yes, sorry. So I'm sure there will be also differing opinions within, amongst the press. I'm not purporting to speak on behalf of every journalist, of course, but I also would say that, again, extensive stakeholder consultation is needed to get a bit more of a comprehensive picture, whether this is something that could be actually protective or not. And of course, as you say, the law might protect them. The reality is compliance is not always there, but this is why I think there needs to be a specific risk assessment, which I understand has been done in the context of the Red Cross emblem, for example, to make sure that the practical impact is not doesn't have unintended consequences as we're living in the real world and trying to protect journalists that will be facing real threats. Of course, ideally, I understand the intention is good. The intention is to protect, but we don't want to create anything or promote anything that could potentially have the exact opposite effect. And it might have a protective effect in some instances, and it might have been an increasing the risk factor effect in other instances. But I don't think one presentation or even 5 presentations by different journalists will be sufficient to make that assessment.
So as a chair bias for action, I'll also like to suggest, and to everyone in the room, that when you do see things that should be written differently, the authors are going to, I heard, start a 3rd draft, which they will then share with the list, and then text suggestions are absolutely welcome and encouraged. They will act as editors when adopted by the working group. It is co-authored by the whole working group. I would say the room and we are in total agreement that we need more representation in this room.
Good afternoon, Roman Danelu. I'm speaking as an individual. Thanks so much for providing this table, walking through the different use cases, and then providing a table so we can see the easy compare and contrast. I wanted to clarify my kind of understanding of how you've laid out the requirements. So the Red Cross, the Blue Shield, and the press use cases, to me, seem like you have the same emblem, and then you're just affixing the same thing in multiple places for that use case. So the emblem is always the same. The way I understood the requirements for the Ramsar and the OPCW, it sounded like there was additional metadata that needed to be carried. And so does that mean that's dynamically in the emblem, or the bearing protocol is carrying additional information? If that distinction kind of makes sense.
Just a footnote on the Red Cross, Blue Shield, and press being the same. They serve a very similar purpose, namely a protective one. Like you want to signal that you shouldn't attack something, but the emblems are all different, like just the footnote. But
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to misspeak. Yes,
Yeah.
the emblems are different, but every time you use it for that use case, it's always the identical version or representation of said emblem.
What you said was correct in spirit. Yeah, just wanted to make the footnote. Thanks.
Okay, with cases where we're talking about, say, the OPCW or Ramsar, I think we're completely willing to acknowledge that DNS might not be the best primary discovery mechanism, meaning that if I were to go in and search, I wouldn't have the FQDN to actually perform that search within DNS. So in many cases, those would have some sort of what I had thought of was like a domain discovery mechanism that was separate, that would then point back to a DNS record that would have the authentication and some other critical fields.
So if I could just ask a clarifying kind of question. So what we're saying is all this additional meta information like contains the textual description quantity. Is that embedded in the emblem, or is now the emblem something that redirects you to where that is? I'm just trying to understand whether the thinking is that's in the protocol or outside the protocol. Thank you.
Sure. At this point, we haven't actually fully addressed that. My sense is that that's going to be something that we're going to address for each use case when we actually define the protocol, but we do want to allow space for some sort of bridging mechanism to allow for either the inclusion of more data than will fit in a DNS record safely, or mechanism for figuring out which fully qualified domain name we actually want, the person actually wants to refer to.
Very good. Thank you. Richard Wilhelm. Thank you for putting together the draft. I've not been following the discussion on the mailing list, but I have read the draft closely. So if some of this was discussed in the mailing list, I apologize in advance. Some questions about section 4.1 in the document. I was surprised by a couple of things. The first is that this section seems to only contemplate, as far as I can tell, a digital emblem for things like web servers, personal use devices, and such.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Question. So you said the draft, there are two drafts. I presume you mean the one that is linked under resources?
The one that we're talking about.
Well, that's the thing. We're not talking about individual drafts. Just for, you want to say something? Or?
Sure.
Yeah. We linked two documents which are inputs to a future requirements draft.
Okay.
So we don't have a working group requirements draft because we just started as a working group and the discussions have been frankly very fractious. So you can, if you have a specific thing that you think is relevant to the overall scope of requirements here that's relevant from a document, that's great, but we're not going to discuss a specific document particularly. So
the plan is to write
what do you think is, like, tell us what you think is good, or something that you saw in a presentation that you think is bad. That's good input.
Okay, so it wasn't exactly discussed, and so I think that not quite sure how to parry that.
I mean, so I think you've read the linker draft, correct?
I read the use cases draft.
Yeah, but there are two. But only one is linked under the resources of the working group. The other one was circulated on the mailing list. So because you said you didn't look at the mailing list, I presume
it's draft Foxstein use cases. I've linked it in the chat.
As DKG said.
Okay, then it's your draft. Okay.
As I read what DKG said. Yeah, I read that draft. Are we entertaining questions about that or not? I'm chill. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not agitated. I'm horizontal.
So, given what you saw in the presentation, is there something from that draft that you saw that you think is that you either want to ask a question about? So what's in, what's out, or how does that work?
Yeah. Okay. So sure.
Okay.
Yeah. This is okay. So we got there. Thank you. In that, related to the stuff I read in that draft, I was surprised that the items in 4.1, which related to what are stated as the Red Cross requirement, didn't include marking of physical assets, because when my read of that indicated that they would be useful for marking of physical assets, things like web servers, personal use devices, such as laptops and tablets. And so I was surprised to see that section constrained to be only a digital mark. So that's probably a good way to kind of sum it up. So I'll probably stop there since we're not technically discussing the draft. But as far as that chart that we have on the screen, the first column that I think refers to the Red Cross stuff, I was surprised that there shouldn't be X's somewhere in the lower three, probably the where it says object in that bottom row. That's sort of the summation of somewhere between a question and a comment. Because like if I'm a doctor and I'm working with Doctors Without Borders, right, and I'm like got a Red Cross on my arm, shouldn't my laptop have a sticker on it so that someone can't come and smash it on the ground?
Just a point of information. Folks who work for Doctors Without Borders don't wear a Red Cross.
Okay. if I work for the Red Cross, and thank you for the
Yeah,
like real-time fact checking at the IETF, right? So if I'm under Red Cross cover and I've got a Red Cross thing on my sleeve, then shouldn't my laptop not be protected from having someone put their boot through it, right?
so
like his.
Yeah, I guess is it okay if Samit comments on that? Quickly, maybe.
And you don't have to answer that in real time.
Yeah.
If you don't
No,
want
but I think it's Samit. You want to comment on that distinction? Yeah, or the question?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and that's within sort of. So there are documents that explain when. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that too close, or?
Just speak to the mic.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So just to clarify, I mean, there are regulations on when to use the emblem and how to use the emblem, and the idea is to be as specific as necessary. So indeed, for physical assets, we do put the emblem on it because there are situations where, I don't know, we might be at a checkpoint and someone might want to look through like a computer, and you would say, look, physically there's an emblem on this, like it's protected. So yes, to answer the question quickly, yeah, of course, like physical assets will have the emblem, but you don't need the emblem for the protection. So even like a pen potentially you could say is protected, but we wouldn't put an emblem on a pen. So you go kind of as closely as possible as necessary to make the protection meaningful, if that makes sense.
Two fingers? Okay, so does that mean that there's a bug in the chart? I mean, if physical, wouldn't there be a mark in the chart to denote that we've got a physical use case in the Red Cross section? That's the question.
Hey, I'm your AD. I'm just gonna, interrupt here. We've got a queue. I definitely want to hear from all the folks in the queue and your reaction to, what the folks here are presenting. I just want to clarify that, this charter, we had a lot of discussions on the mailing list. The scope is narrow. Folks already have mentioned in our first working group meeting, you're thinking about rechartering or adjusting the scope. As your AD, I would really like to see some evidence that we can work together, listen to the presenters, bring the comments to the list, and process the discussion in the tradition of the IETF. So I don't want to hear the rechartering discussion in here right now. What I want to hear is reactions to the chairs and following the instructions of the chairs and contributing to the agenda for the working group. Thanks.
I'm just registering my support for including people and objects above the line, not below the line. And also wanted to point out that all the phytosanitary stuff includes variable data in the emblem itself, and that one certainly wouldn't want to define a digital emblem mechanism which failed to include the ability to contain variable data.
Nick Doty.
Hi, everyone. Nick Doty, Center for Democracy and Technology. I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to try to I'm going to try to follow the AD and chair suggestions to stick to clarifications. I found the selective disclosure definition confusing. Selective disclosure is often used in credentials work to describe the property of having a larger document and revealing only certain parts of that document in a particular presentation. That has particular cryptographic implications, which is why there's lots of work in other working groups on selective disclosure. But that's very different from properties like not always presenting a document or presenting documents to different people or knowing who you're presenting a document to. All of those are different requirements. So I would prefer that we not use overloaded language if we made it in a different sense. And two, if we could describe that requirement in more detail, maybe we could find other language that would work better.
Yeah, apologies on my end for that confusion. I think what Rohan earlier said was already accurate. I made this suggestion to use this name. It was just a presentation device. I didn't intend to carry all the load of this term. So yeah, thanks for the feedback, and we'll incorporate it.
Hi. So I would like to see that line move down. Pretty much it's necessary for me. I also don't understand exactly how that line came up and fits where it fits. As I've said before in previous meetings, I'll reiterate, I think a well-formed standard here would be extensible, and we're building a family of RFCs with a core technology and then extensible data in the payloads or whatever. And so person, place, thing, and various use cases beyond that all completely seem within scope to me.
Duly noted, and we will move it.
Yep.
Okay, let's see who we is. So I think like we're kind of leaving the clarifying questions territory. I would like to express my opinion about what has been said right now, but I'm not sure whether it's a good time right now.
Yeah, so Leif, do you have a clarifying question, or do you have an opinion? Because we can switch.
I have feedback, but along the lines of yeah.
So I think we can go on. We're going to unlock the queue, but if you've got some, so I think what we're going to probably do is ask you guys to go, and like you guys can respond at the mic as individual contributors.
Yeah, I'll queue, but then let's go through the question on the presentation first, or do we go back now?
I mean, I
Go ahead.
So, Leif Johansson, I would actually argue that this if this is an accurate representation of the use cases, I strongly consider not actually including people, persons in scope, because again, I'm whoever was speaking from Article 29, and I think your comments about the press use case being fairly diverse. In some projects we're working with the investigative journalists, I can actually confirm, confirm that it's not that simple as listening to somebody from Reuters who have a very, very different perspective, I think, on sort of the amount of protection you need. So I would actually consider maybe not even, or if you're doing people at all, treat that problem as a digital credentials problem, and like do it hand to hand, lock arms with the SPICE working group, and do emblems as part of digital credentials, because for people, I think they should be, especially digital attestations or claims about people that look like emblems should actually be implemented like digital credentials, and they should follow the same sort of architecture. We should use the same terms. We should think about it as selective disclosure in every way, right? That's my opinion about it. But it is different for stuff, and I think because the risk calculation is very, very different.
Could you just hang on real quick?
Sure.
So if we have a community of people, say, for example, from the press, that want to be able to have emblems that refer to people whose bearers are people, and another group that do not, do you see a problem with one group of, one press organization having emblems that have people with digital emblems and another that does not, where one simply chooses not to issue any emblems for
normally I wouldn't, but I would definitely be on the side of give everybody sort of enough rope to hang themselves, right? But in this case, this group seems to want to create like universal concepts that are globally applicable, right? There isn't going to be different red crosses depending on what kind of protection you want, right? You're just going to have one concept of a red cross or a red crescent, right? So I think if you're going to include press in that, I think you have to have universal concepts around press and protection around journalists, and you can't just sort of have a local concept of press protection. So in this particular case, Rowan, no, I don't think it is appropriate to say if it works for some, it's okay.
So to clarify the discussion, and that this came up in the context of this red line that the presenters drew, we put it back up to highlight that this line is for initial scope, meaning what the technical mechanisms are that can be worked on without a recharter. What's below the line is not to be excluded from the requirements draft that we're talking about in this first deliverable that would determine what belongs here.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, but what I would like to say, I guess, in terms of this red line is that if you're going to, in your requirements draft, consider moving the line or talk about stuff below the line, make it very clear that there are some differences here, right? A digital emblem applied to a physical object is potentially a tracking mechanism. Can't get around that.
Very good. So note to the authors.
And by the way, there was in the slides, there was a specific comment about being able to turn emblems off for the press use case. That was one of the things which was identified at the first BOF as a requirement. So that being able to turn it off, that is in there already in the description that already existed.
Yep, okay.
All right. Simone?
Hello, Simone, talking by an individual and talking as an evil person. First of all, thank you for all of you for bringing DIEM alive. That was fantastic from the first paper. And my suggestion is to consider also malicious use cases in the use case document. Because as they said, having an emblem maybe on your device, that can be, so you can signal that you are a high-level target. And I see a more critical use case, malicious use case, for example, for DNS. Because if I'm thinking about open source intelligence software used by bad actors, they can maybe map a lot of interesting targets quickly. And this can maybe decrease the security of this kind of organization. So this can be considered in the use case document.
Yeah, hi Felix, Lincoln out the new mic. I wanted to comment on the placement of the red line, and I'm of the opinion that it should not move down. I had a discussion earlier about places, for example, and I thought, yeah, okay, it's not too hard to identify a place in the DNS, and initially we'll identify bearers of emblems via a fully qualified domain name, and an A record is probably not too different to maybe like a polygon record that defines some coordinates. That's not too hard, I can see that. But binding a domain name to a person or an object and writing standards that do that, to me, is a whole different beast. And if someone presented me a draft that specified that and said this matches the initial scope of this working group, I would be very surprised. And I think it's also what Live said about reusing credential standards and work. I think that's absolutely necessary and would need to be tied to that stream of work, because there's a lot of expertise that has been going into that area.
Hi, this is Chantal again. I just wanted to react quickly on this ability to turn off and on the emblem. I think the point is as well, I mean, people who are not, and this includes myself, necessarily super familiar with these technical standards, what they do not do. It's very difficult, I think, for the average journalist to make an informed risk assessment what this will mean for them. So I think that's why we need to have proper discussion, stakeholder consultation, when we can bridge this gap between what this group is doing and those who will be the bearers, stakeholders who are supposed to be protected by this. And I don't think it's sufficient to sort of hand out a tool and then tell the journalist in Sudan or Gaza, might be useful for you, might not be useful for you. Who is going to explain it to them specifically, how it's going to work, how they can input, when can they input and say, look, here I see a risk. Is it possible to adjust this? When can they ask questions and still influence how the standard is going to be developed, rather than be, presented with a finished emblem, whether it might work for them or not?
So to answer that question, as that involves IETF process, the engagement with the IETF is exactly as you see here. And so to answer your literal question of how do they ensure that they're not, if I may paraphrase, get delivered a product at the end without input on the design, we need to bring them here to this meeting. If there are difficulties, if you know of such stakeholders who are having difficulties with that, please send them to us, because the IETF has a lot of outreach effort to ensure that we can maximize attendance.
And to add on to that, you don't need to come to, to fly across the world to go attend a meeting for a week. Somebody who says clearly, these are, I have a problem with XYZ requirement on the mailing list, or I think that we need to have this requirement, that is just as useful as coming here in person.
Okay.
Which, to that point, because I just realized now this may not be common knowledge among this group, all official decisions in terms of moving documents forward, adopting, publishing, have to have a consensus call on the list. It can't be done here by itself. We can do it to see indicated interest, but the list is exactly where you can participate, where you are part of the process. Does that help?
Sorry, just briefly. I mean, I appreciate it. I think, though, that online, probably if we were to do a survey right now, there are very few journalists actually in the room and actually factually influencing this process, right? Of course, we will be interested in collaborating and bridging that gap and talk to more press freedom groups and see how this process has to be established. But what I'm saying is that is a very complex undertaking and not a quick one. So hence, we just think we're not ready to include this use case at this point, basically.
Jim Reed, for those who are out there on the net. A couple of quick points, and there's some useful comments to be made recently. First one is, if we start talking about emblems for people, we're then automatically going to run into problems with data protection and the horrors of GDPR and its equivalents in other parts of the world. So at this stage, this will be something for the authors of any documents to bear in mind as they develop those use cases and requirements. These problems are not necessarily intractable, but it's something we'll need to be aware of as we develop the documents. There was also a question that Stefano, I apologize if I got his name wrong, mentioned about bad actors and malicious actors. I think in principle that's relatively straightforward to solve, says me hand waving at the microphone here, and I'm doing the hand waving for the benefit of everyone that's not in the room. If we're looking at this in a hierarchical naming scheme mechanism, either through domain names or perhaps certificates, if we can think of it conceptually at least as that the Red Cross is notionally responsible for issuing digital emblems for agents of the Red Cross, then hopefully at that point they can do the validation of those actors before they issue them with an emblem. And the same thing would apply. And if it's not going to be a domain name or something that goes into the DNS, maybe it could some variation of an X509 certificate issued or signed by the relevant competent authority. So yes, there's a potential problem here, but I think it's at least in theory at least, I think it should be straightforward to solve or accommodate. Famous last words.
All right, sorry, I'm here, Leif, again, I'm here to belabor the point, a process point, right? I mean, we used to run a working group in the IETF called Tigress, and it was based on the premise of sort of building car key, support for car keys into wallets. And we could never actually get the car key manufacturers into the room to do the work. And we, as a result, we closed the working group. Now, I think that it's not the onus on, the burden isn't on the journalists to find the IETF and come here, right? The burden is on the IETF to figure out who to talk to, and if we can't, don't do it.
I'll point out that we did have folks from a number of these at the first BOF.
We had that in Tigers as well, but they never turned up after that. And then we closed the working group. I'm saying that it's not enough to have somebody in the room on day one.
I think we're all in agreement on that point. Thanks.
All right, so seeing the queue empty with 45 minutes remaining is a bit unexpected. To prod the room a little, our goal here is to be able to do a temperature check at the end of this meeting to see what the working group has some agreement on in terms of what the structure of the document that Rahel and Felix will be working on should look like, what should not be in it. So if you have opinions about that you want them to hear before they start work, now's the time.
Rahel, please.
Sure. So one additional idea that didn't make it into the slides, but that I think is worth considering, was that of, in some cases, would we need to have some form of ledger to indicate when an emblem was visible, and not necessarily in a way where someone could just go through said ledger to understand who has an emblem, but someone who has a knowledge of which emblem they're looking for could go back and say, these are the times when it was visible for forensics purposes.
So if I were to rephrase that in requirements neutral language, there would be a way to verify if a particular emblem was visible at a particular time.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So as a reminder, the questions here at the bottom of the slide are the ones that we are posing to you. So for those of you who may not see the slide or want some prompt thinking, did we misrepresent any use cases, which we've had some discussion on? Do the document structure and goals make sense? Which I'm not sure we've had as much of that would allow the authors to take action, and then anything else. There we go.
Hi, Loic Klima, T-Systems. I'm pretty new to the topic, and I was surprised when I saw the slide that there's nothing about critical infrastructure. And I would be interested in why it is not included, looking at like electricity, dams, hospitals, and so on. And yeah, maybe there's prior discussion I don't know about. There's pretty sure prior discussion I don't know about, but I would be interested in why it's not included.
So I can speak to that a little bit. The set of use cases that we put up was not meant to be a comprehensive one. So critical infrastructure very well could be something that would have a digital emblem representing its protected status.
Yeah, or to add something to that, we intend to also add the dangerous forces emblem to the document. It's in my draft, it's already in there. The dangerous forces emblem is one of the 4 emblems recognized under international humanitarian law, which, for example, marks nuclear power plants and dikes. So yeah. As such, it will make it into the draft, if it were up to me.
Yeah. Also, I'd like to point out that for some of the use cases, we had even less stakeholder feedback than for the representative use cases that were presented here. So the goal is for us to give you, to give you a sort of a flavor, a amuse-bouche, as it were, of the work to come. Just put yourself in the queue. Nick, you're next.
Yeah, I was a little bit confused about the querying described in the slides. Querying by geographic location, or some of the drafts describe other ways of binding to different things. That seems like a large universe of work on discovery protocols. It seems like something that wouldn't be in the initial scope, and maybe the idea is, well, we're going to put in this very broad set of requirements and just mark which things aren't in the initial scope. But querying by geographic location, or querying by all the different ways that you could associate some piece of data with something in the world, just seems like a lot. So it would be a lot more work for us, and I hope we think about that as we're trying to describe this document.
Yeah, I just want to register support for including the civil defense and dangerous forces emblems, since they are of equal weight under international law.
TKG.
Hi, I think I'm probably just going to echo what Nick just said, which is I worry about this document deliberately overreaching the charter. And I think that's a recipe for us doing stuff that doesn't help us with the narrow scope. So prune where you can.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I also agree with Bill and Felix on dangerous forces. So that's, of course, an emblem we've considered. So dangerous forces are, as Felix said, dams, dikes, and nuclear generating facilities that potentially will release dangerous forces if they're attacked. So they have a specific protection under international humanitarian law. If you're interested, Article 56 of Additional Protocol 1. So yeah, that's a specific emblem we've considered as well. The other one being civil defense, Article 66 of Additional Protocol 1, also a specific protection under international humanitarian law. The reason we've focused on talking about the Red Cross Crescent and Crystal, and then eventually the Blue Shield, you know, in our discussions with UNESCO, is precisely going back to what Chantal said, is that we had sort of a 3-year consultative process, you know, on the usefulness of these emblems, multi-stakeholder consultations on the Red Cross, Crescent and Crystal, where we've spoken to hospitals, by the way, so part of critical infrastructure as well. We've spoken to hospitals, we've spoken, you know, within the broader movement, as you've seen in the chat, with states, with cyber operators more broadly, to be sure that this is a tool that's actually useful, that's something that's going to be used, and that's something that can actually be incorporated into international humanitarian law. And so we worked on that at first, and that was really an intensive process for several years. And now we're also working on other emblems of international humanitarian law, but of course it should be included in our perspective. So totally agree with Bill and Felix on that.
Very good feedback on content. Noting the empty queue, I'd like to prod the audience on something that came up earlier in terms of the structure of the requirements. I know Jim at least mentioned we should split them out versus having a monolithic list. I kind of want to poke the room to see, how do you feel about that? Do you want to see multiple documents? Do you want to see a single document with requirements by use case? Do you want to see a single document with use cases, then single list of requirements? I think were different options I've heard today.
If so, it's out the queue. Andrew Campling for the note takers. In my view, smaller documents, single use cases, because then conceivably we could finish one and then move on to the next one, rather than having something which takes a possibly long time to complete because there's something contentious in one use case, which means that it takes far longer than we would anticipate.
Eric Rank, and sorry, Andrew, I will disagree with you. I think it's important to at least have the requirements pretty well defined, what a requirement means before getting the use case. Right? But doing this is kind of complex, so I would rather go like we are heading a single document describing all the use case, this use case, this requirement, and at the end, requirements. because you need to be sure that consistency between all your documents.
And just for process, is that hat on or hat off? As AD or as individual?
Oh, heads off, sorry. Here, okay. I'm not an AD. The only AD here is him.
Hi, Kurshavat Global, IRL, always speaking for myself. I guess going through the use cases, my question was, sorry, two-parter, depends on the answer to the first one. Are the use cases limited to instances, people, situations that do have specific protection under international law? Or is everything else excluded?
No, so the exclusion is based on what the initial scope is in the charter, and then as defined by this document to be what the fringes the working group considers to be a candidate for rechartering.
I see. And what was your sense of the room, that we are expanding to the use cases that may not have specific protection under international law?
So the actual concept of saying digital emblems are defined as something that is under international humanitarian law is not a concrete part of the charter. They are a clear example, and they've been an active community here in this group, but an emblem doesn't necessarily need an international humanitarian law to be considered an emblem. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. But the use cases documents, then we're all accepting, is covering cases that are actually not protected by international law, even now, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Roman Danilo is an individual, keeping on the theme of we have a narrow charter, let's execute. The question was posed, do we want lots of use case document or one use case document? My recommendation would be one use case document. If you're in a multiple use case document, when do you declare done? There are means to an end to do the protocol work. And so if we finish one document and there's some other topic that's contentious, that means we continue working on the use case. We can't start on the protocol work. And so we're blocked either way. So I would recommend, trying to document some subset of use cases and then move on to the actual work that gets the protocol done and gets it fielded.
Go ahead, Erin.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with having one document. I think with one document capturing the use cases, you can start to see trends, right? You can start to see patterns of similarities, which you can't see if everything's separated out into different documents. So I think we'll be able to come up with a better concrete list of requirements, perhaps even priorities, if we have everything consolidated. Thank you.
With an empty queue and hearing a few individuals talking about having a consolidation or even a shrinking, would Jim or others who are proposing to have separate and variety step up and help challenge that?
I'm not going to challenge it. I'll just say, I'll go with the flow. If the sense of the room is we want a single document, then let's just do a single document and let's not waste our time arguing over it.
Hi, Ori Steele, as your AD. I do want to kind of come back to some of the bullet points in the charter, and I know, the first deliverable is use case requirements that can be addressed by the initial scope, and the initial scope is constrained. I want to echo what Roman said about this being kind of dangerous to spend a ton of time in. So I would focus on the initial scope, and I would focus on discussion in this initial use cases document where you can get clarity around the initial scope. And I would be careful about describing in your use cases document in detail things that are outside of your initial scope, because that conversation could go on for a very long time, and that document is any of that, all of that content would be outside of your initial charter scope. So I just want to, underline that point. I think we can make a lot of progress on that as, in a single document, as long as the initial scope is being respected per the deliverables.
Or can we get clarity on something?
Sure.
So for example, if we've got a use case for Ramsar and we've got, 6 requirements and 4 of them are covered into the initial scope and you could reasonably use them. And then you have 1 or 2 additional requirements which are not covered under the initial scope, which would make the solution better, but wouldn't be strictly needed under like an initial deployment. That would be okay under what you described.
So I'm interested in the part of those requirements that is aligned with the initial scope. I'm willing to imagine that there are scenarios where this is just one component of a potential solution. But what I'm interested in is the overlap for these different use cases where the initial scope overlap is made very clear. And I wouldn't want to read a document with lots of elaboration around details that were not in the initial scope of your charter at any point in time, really.
Thank you.
Andrew Campling, just responding to the prompt from our chairs. I suppose the phrase minimum viable products brings to mind as a useful guide in this thing, and also obviously agreeing with the AD, but that goes without saying.
Hi, this is Rahel Feinstein with Johns Hopkins. So one of the things or questions I wanted to pose to folks who were saying that it should be limited to the scope, including Ori and Roman, were about how they would balance that necessity versus the reality of the potential priming effect of working on a certain use case and having a preconceived notion potentially of what the structure of a digital emblem should be. How do you think we should account for that problem?
So I'm gonna try and take my hat off to answer you for this one. So Ori Steele, speaking as an individual, I think the IETF is a great place to work on problems that are fundamental to the internet and where we're building on existing widely deployed internet protocols, taking advantage of the expertise and knowledge and operational experience that's in the room and outside of these rooms in the hallways. And so I think for us to be successful at anything in the IETF, we need to be able to take advantage of what we're good at, and we need to avoid trying to do things that we're not maybe great at. And so part of what I think is good about the initial scope that we have, and I was part of creating it, as were many of the other folks in the room here, is it tries to focus us on what the IETF can maybe have some technical expertise and experience around, which is the DNS. And so I think that that's where we can, if we can focus on use cases that are tied into that, where we're using the DNS as a way of looking at the problem, we're going to be able to take advantage of people who have a lot of experience thinking about problems in that dimension. I've heard, we've all heard in the room and in the course of the BOF that people think about this problem in many different ways, but there are at least some of us who are thinking about it in terms of the DNS and its impact on that part of the internet. And speaking as an individual, that's a part of the internet that I want to see protected. With these technologies, I want to see the DNS used to do these kinds of markings. I think Roman's point about, are we, is this a pointer or is it carrying attributes? I think that's the kind of, question that we needed a working group, we needed chairs, we need our process to kind of work through and think about. And so, I don't have answers for that piece, but I think that the more that we can stick to what the IETF is good at and, the folks here who can share their experience around those pieces, the more successful we'll be. Thanks.
I apologize, I can't queue up, my battery died. So I was asked to kind of answer the, I was about to answer the question. I guess where I'm coming from is I'm concerned that we're overgeneralizing the solution, and in overgeneralizing solution, we're so overcomplicating it, and it really concerns me we may not be able to get to some of the early, more simple use cases because we're trying to optimize a lot of complexity for things that we don't understand. And so I don't clearly have an idea how to generalize that, but that's or how to kind of approach your direct kind of question. But that's my guiding principle, is to try to tackle the earlier, better understood use cases, as Ori said, for the technologies we understand well.
Hello, can I speak?
Yes. First on
Thank
the
you.
queue.
Yes. So, yeah, I want to echo what I heard from Rahel. This is Erin Moiling from Oxford Information Labs. So I think there's, you know, how our human brain works is we get started on a topic, and as we hear more information, it triggers other additional thoughts and great ideas and things that we need to be concerned about and so forth. And it seems to me that if we're going to be brainstorming, we should not be limiting ourselves. And I think that's why you came up with a great idea, which is that let's put things on the plate, and then we can come up with marking out the now and later. So I would encourage us to even think about the later, because I think it'll actually impact the now. I think as we embark into more expansion of what we could do or what we should consider, then more will come about as to what we can actually conquer right now. So I don't want to, I know some people maybe already have preconceived ideas of solutions, but I think having a free flow brainstorming is also useful. Thank you.
So, so this will be the last time I get up. I want to add my voice of support to what Ori and Roman said. Like, keep it simple. Do something that's tractable. Filter the wish list through tractability, and implement something that is sort of possible to do with the expertise in the room. And that actually is the opposite of what whoever was last, I forget the name, said. Let's not brainstorm too much. Let's solve one or two problems well, and then see where we are.
Okay. So I'm just going to make one clarifying point. I'm taking my hat off. I'm going to make one clarifying point as if I were at the microphone, which is that the use cases, we should be able to document a whole, what is required for a whole emblem type, and address that emblem or not address that emblem. But if we have that, so in other words, if we have requirements that we can't address right away, that doesn't mean that that emblem doesn't have, and it has another requirement, that doesn't mean that we can't address it later with another mechanism. So for example, if there's a physical use case, we can address that later. So I absolutely agree that we should not have use cases where we don't have information about what the requirements are for that use case, for that emblem type at all. We don't want to create a wish list of those. Okay, I'm putting my hat back on.
We have 1 minute before we're going to transition into some analysis of the discussion, if anyone wants to take the last word.
Okay, so please give us a minute. We're going to try to come up with a couple of questions that we can ask the group.
All right, so for those of you who are new to the IETF, that tool we asked you to join, you'll want to use that now. In the tool, you'll see a pop-up that says there's a show of hands coming. It's going to ask a question. You can say, raise your hand, specifically not raise your hand, or specifically not do anything. This is a useful tool for us to take a temperature check in the room. Literal vote numbers are not relevant because this isn't voting. We're doing a show of hands, which helps us say, okay, there's some consensus that if the authors tried this, we could have a productive discussion about it versus, wow, we don't have a good direction yet. So that will be coming up momentarily. Please get into your, oh, it now says yes, no, or no opinion. No hand, and yet it calls it a show of hands. So you should see a pop-up that says a new show of hands has been started. Click here to show it.
So can we limit the emblem types or use cases we consider in the requirements to ones where we can get stakeholder participation?
And we'll let this run for a minute and give people a chance to tally up.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, are you really asking, can we, or are you asking, should we?
Feel free to answer the question as if it should.
Bill, go ahead.
I'd just like to point out that if we continue to do the thing of saying that, well, somebody showed up at one meeting, but they're not here right now, therefore we can discount everything that they've said, the stakeholder participation becomes a very moving goalpost.
So, chair hat on, participation includes list discussion. So I would definitely be discouraged to see the authors declare someone who's participating in the mailing list, but not showing up to the meeting as not participating. Does that address your concern, Bill?
Well, if people get frustrated because their views are not paid attention to and stop participating, then it leaves the only voices in the room being the people who manage to do the frustrating, which I think is the problem we are seeing with the press participation.
I think I speak for both of us and I say we'll take that as direct feedback to us to ensure that we can moderate a good, healthy environment.
Yeah, Bill's comment is well made, and I think we have to be mindful of the possibility that people might feel they're going to be excluded or not being listened to. But if there's a drop-off in a particular stakeholder segment not participating in discussions for a while, I would then upwardly promote this on to our esteemed co-chairs to try and chase up those people to find out why they've walked away.
Okay, so we're going to stop this show of hands. I am curious to hear from someone who voted no to give your reasoning, please.
I voted no for the reason I just articulated, which is that I worry that if we have the moving goalpost of you have to be here right now to be represented, then we're going to have a problem.
Yeah, it is certainly not my intent that you have to be present, physically present at a meeting, or active, on a sort of weekly basis in order to have your views included.
So
DKG?
I actually voted yes, but thinking about it a little bit more clearly, I want to just make that a little more of a nuanced yes, which is that I'm not sure that we can get stakeholder participation from the attackers who are reviewing these emblems. And I think they're actually a really critical constituency here. And so the more that we can solicit attackers who might consider reviewing these emblems, the better. but mostly we're hearing people who want to bear the emblems, and that is, I think, challenging for this work.
Do you have a proposal for a way to make this working group more inclusive for attackers?
Nope.
Okay.
We had the Dutch military here in at the Dublin meeting saying exactly what they're doing.
Yep.
We also had a member of the United States Air Force, I think, also. So it's possible, but again, I think as chairs we can take that as energy we need to continue getting more participants here.
Sarah, please make sure that that action item is reflected in the notes. Thank you very much. Audrey. For you may be muted. We do not hear you.
Sorry, I checked no. I was biding my time. I checked no, largely, and based on the word "can you." I don't believe that once you start one of these things, that those that are feeling excluded, that will care about the attendance account, will even necessarily be fully aware of what was going on, will be able to leave you in peace to do it. So I actually don't believe that you can ignore that which is only represented by people who aren't there. I think you have to be aware that you're not going to be able to limit it without causing yourself a lot of sorrow. Thanks.
Okay, and how would you propose that we finish a requirements document under those circumstances? I mean, finish in a very vague phase.
I think you could certainly encourage, I think you can ever, but at the end of the day, if somebody comes through with an opinion that you haven't heard or on an emblem that hasn't been covered, you can't say, yeah, but you weren't here. So strong encouragement, strong, pulling people in, strong when you hear something discussed that isn't somebody that's in the room, there's an outreach to them. Certainly that. So strong encouragement, but a statement that if you didn't participate enough, tough is just not something you'll be able to live with. And that's just an opinion, obviously. But I've seen discussions like this where attendance was made a criteria, and it eventually becomes sorrow.
Felix.
Yeah, a comment on what DKG said about getting attackers into the room. I think, and also maybe a bit about what Bill said regarding the hard requirements on stakeholders being present. I voted yes, and for me, I think every use case that is reflected in the document just needs to have a reasonable case for having been thoroughly evaluated by stakeholders. Whether that's in a document that is published somewhere on the internet, whether that's in discussions that happen outside the IETF, I just think you need to be able to convince people that yes, the relevant stakeholders looked at it and they said it was good, or they approved of it. That would be my personal requirement. And then for the attackers, we have been discussing reaching out via various channels as you can do it. I agree. It's a weakness of the collaboration we've had with the ICRC so far, and this is something that we will try to fix. Though it's hard to make promises there. Just wanted to say that it's being discussed and we're on it.
Yeah, maybe I would just add, echoing what Felix just said, of course, it's a challenge to get attackers in the room. To clarify, for those of you that don't know, the mandate of the International Committee of the Red Cross includes what we call a confidential bilateral dialogue with, let's say, a range of different actors. So one thing that's been key, for me is to be sure indeed that this is something that would actually, like when we talk about the Red Cross Crescent and Crystal, a digital version of that, to be sure that's something that would work. And maybe kind of an advice for some of the other, people working on other digital emblems. One thing that we've sort of pivoted on is to say, can you join these meetings? No, for geopolitical or other obvious reasons. Are there other ways that you can sort of voice support for the work that's going on? Because we don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf of attackers, obviously. Like that's not something, I can do or the ICRC will ever do. So instead, what we look at is having sort of public statements of support for this work. So, I've mentioned in the past the International Conference resolution that was adopted in October last year by 196 states by consensus, supporting in operative paragraph 12 the work by the ICRC on, a digital Red Cross Crescent and Crystal. And we've tried to do that in other ways. So you've seen some other documents, I shared them on the list, and we'll continue to try to do that. But there's this sensitivity, and I agree, it's kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about attackers, because they do say bilaterally, we support this, we would respect this, but then it's hard to come and tell you who said that, in what context, etc. And I personally don't feel comfortable doing that. So I won't speak on behalf of attackers. So voila.
Go ahead.
Hi, Andrew Campling. Just a quick comment. If there's very little or no engagement with a would-be beneficiary, then I think we should be very cautious about proceeding. And I'm reminded of an example of in one of the DNS working groups where there was a bunch of work done on providing a solution to a problem. When someone actually got around to talking to the would-be beneficiaries, they said in fairly clear terms that they were totally disinterested in accepting the gift of this solution and would never implement it, at which point, thankfully, the work stopped. But it just sort of underlines, if we don't get that engagement, we just need to be cautious whether it's worth doing.
Bill, do you have a new comment on this, or?
Yeah, responding in part to Andrew, I don't really understand the fixation on individual users. Like, we don't really talk about HTTPS in terms of what one specific organization is going to use it for and whether they want to disallow other people for using it for other purposes. We don't talk about SMTP in terms of whether Chevron is going to use it or not. And if Chevron doesn't use it, it's less legitimate.
Right.
Yeah.
Chevron also doesn't have a law that says thou shalt do such and such. And so we do need to understand what the actual requirements are. Noted. We've got another poll.
Okay, so the second, oh, perfect. Okay, so the second poll says, should we attempt to include a concise but full set of requirements for an emblem type that has partial support in the initial charter? So to clarify this question, if an emblem use case fully fits within the initial charter, of course it goes in. This is asking the question that was teased earlier. If a use case has 5 requirements and 3 of them are in the initial scope and 2 of them are not, should we include it in this document?
And I want to clarify that we're assuming that you can still do something useful with the first 3.
Right. So we're going to let it run for a little bit, but the early signal is pretty strongly yes, so we encourage anyone who entered no to queue up at the mic line. Go ahead.
Maybe I'm confused about this question, but I'm reading this as saying that we should try to make a full description of requirements for something that only has partial support in the charter, and I think that's excessive.
So to be clear, the question's intent is to say, not to, so use case has requirements 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3 are in initial scope, 4 and 5 are not. This question is asking, should 1, 2, and 3 be included for this use case, not 4 and 5. But the point being that maybe other use cases that are fully in the initial scope don't have 1, 2, and 3. And so 1, 2, and 3 are unique and in scope, but represented by a use case that has other requirements that are not in the initial scope. Does that help clarify? I'm now even more confused. This is why we leave these polls open. Noting people can change their answer as they clarify. Go ahead.
Okay, let's hear from Roman, and then we'll come back to it.
Roman as an individual, I guess I'd like to better understand, what do we do with the use cases and the requirements we're not servicing? Like, why would we collect them? And so maybe some understanding of what we would do with them might, I mean, I said no, so that would kind of influence like why I'd want to see those.
I'm going to go to my client.
We're short on time.
Please raise your hand next time.
Yeah. As an individual, I would like to reply to Roman's question. This is Roman May as an individual. So when we have, when we collect requirements, people tend to be in a certain frame of mind where they are capable of coming up with expressing requirements in a way that does not, that less biases the way in which the requirement is implemented. So we don't have a specific technology, we have less specific technology bias when we ask the questions about requirements at the beginning than after we've already started building something. In addition, knowing that a requirement may come, it may cause us to make a different decision when we have A or B both have the same sort of technical cost or complexity. We may choose one that allows for the possibility for us to implement something in the future if we're aware of the requirement. If we're not aware of the requirement, we won't even know that until we've already made a technical decision that prevents us from making that decision. Thank you.
Tommy, question for you. Your clarification on that particular question was very, very helpful, but could you please write it down? Because I think this is the kind of thing we might forget later on when we come back and revisit some of the documents in, say, a year's time or so, and we might have a different interpretation then about what you said and what you meant.
Yep, will do.
So to answer the initial question, someone who voted no and provide reasoning, for me it seems like the initial scope of the charter is still pretty broad, and I think technically, if you answer this with yes, I don't see any limit, because I think every use case will have, like, so far almost all emblem types require authorization. I believe that specifying mechanisms for authorization is within the initial scope. So yeah, then saying unconditionally yes to this would seem to ignore the feedback that we got from Ori, for example, but maybe I didn't get Tommy's clarification correctly.
So Felix, if you had an emblem, like, let's say, for example, Ramsar, to be concrete, and you could go and use a mechanism that was developed in the initial scope to go query a specific wetland and get information about it and its polygon or a URL pointing at a polygon or whatever. Do you think that that would be in scope? Are you willing to include that?
Yeah, I think that could be in scope. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So even though it has even though there's a requirement that for a full use of that emblem, that you need to do, that people really would like to be able to do discovery, and that's not in scope, and we don't want to do that. In the we may not do that even in this.
Okay, maybe I do the DKG move and make my no to a like a no in quotes. I think we
soft no.
Yeah, a soft no. Yes. I think we would benefit from some limit on the use cases that are included. So I said no, because I saw this as a limit to the use cases. I'm happy to see other limits. But yeah, boiling the ocean or the likes, that's also something I see as a risk.
Roman, go ahead.
Hi, I'm back in the mic line to respond. So Ron, thanks you for clarifying how we would use that. It's just, I have a lot of concern about scope creep here, and I understand the notion of kind of flexibility and not precluding future options, but I think the negative version of that flexibility, the way you described it, is that we actually have shadow requirements, which is they're not in scope, but we will consider them in scope if it's possible to have them in scope, which means we're expanding the nature of kind of scope. And that concerns me because I think that's just an impediment to getting the things that we know how to do, or more likely to know how to do with the technologies we have, less likely to be done, because we're going to keep making the problem bigger and bigger. And I would just want to make some progress rather than solving potentially the whole problem that we don't understand. Thank you.
Yeah. So we're at time. Let's take Miria, and then we may ask one more question. Go for it.
Yes, I try to be quick. So I think it's really hard to talk about this in the abstract. I would propose something more like a soft force here, where you concentrate your working group time on the use cases that are fully in scope, and you get agreement on those ones. And when you're ready, you move on. And if you reach agreement on other use cases at the same point of time, even better. But really try to focus the work time on those that are fully in scope and move on faster.
Give us one moment. All right, hoping this one's a little clearer. Watch out for the final show of hands, and then thank you everyone for being here as we are against time. All right, here we go.
So this is basically coming off of what Miria just said. So the working group shall concentrate discussion on requirements covered by the initial scope, but will not prevent inclusion of out-of-scope requirements which are non-controversial.
So noting that we are a couple minutes over time, I'm going to narrate over this, reminding the room that these are not binding. These are indicators of preference. So looking at the authors, I believe that you have some strong signals from the working group to take into account for your next draft. Looking at this one, which by far looks the least controversial, would then end this discussion with definitely including the ones that are all in scope, opportunistically going for ones that are partially in scope, noting that that is not a definitive rule, but a place for you to start that will give the working group a productive, concrete example on which they can declare consensus or not. A guideline, yes, that's a much better word. Yeah, thank you for coming, everyone. This was an awesome first working group meeting. We will see you on the list.
So using Ori Steele, using my AD hat to say thank you, chairs, for our first working group session. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of the engagement on the mailing list and focusing that discussion on the drafts and our working group process. So thanks again, chairs, and for everyone else who made this working group happen. Thank you.
Also for me, thank you. And feel free to hang out and talk. A lot of work at IETF gets done in hallways. Let's get some of that done. Thank you very much. See you on the list.
See?
Happy to see you that working.